Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very first of a series of conversations that we're going to be hosting, where we will be talking about how to thrive during crisis. I'm sure you can agree with me that one of the challenging things about being in a social media age is that social media can sometimes be very toxic in terms of our interactions with each other. So we're hoping that we can leverage this social media platform to create value and to have conversations that add value. My name is Dumisani Nkala, and I will be moderating this panel. I am joined on the panel by two other panelists. I have Mr. Fabian Gwatidzo of Baker Tilly. He's the CEO of Baker Tilly and a very seasoned auditor and business expert. And with me as well, I have Godfrey Joa, who is the current Managing Director of Telco. And in a short while, we will also have Ms. Sharon Boanya, who is a Chief Operating Officer at an investment and venture capital vehicle. Welcome, panelists. It's good to have you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So as we kick off this panel, one of the things that I'm going to ask is that perhaps in setting the scene where we find ourselves in crisis in 2020, is that each of the panelists sets the scene in terms of what you see besetting business in particular as we face this COVID-19 crisis. What is the backdrop against which we're going to be having this discussion? Maybe I can start off with Godfrey, if you can give us a global view of what you see to be the issues, the current issues that are besetting business as we face the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you, Dumi. Thank you all participants. In late 2019, as we all know, the coronavirus hit us. And it has had a devastating impact on the world economy. As you know, it started in China. Generally, its impact has been very pervasive. It's cut across all sectors and all countries worldwide. The estimation is that the world economy is going to grow by a minuscule 1.5%. Because of the impact of this particular virus. So it's going to have an impact on growth. It has had a huge impact on employment because of the lockdowns and the responses that each country has had to the virus. In America alone, in the last week, they had 6.6 million joblessness claims, following a whole 700,000 job losses. So it has a huge impact worldwide, whether it's on growth, whether it's on employment. We have seen central banks everywhere and governments responding, putting a lot of money into business, putting a whole lot of measures. The US has put $2 trillion in order to support businesses and employees. Europeans have done the same. All over, we've seen governments come in with quantitative easing and mitigatory factors, funds that they're putting in to try and mitigate the impact of the virus. Central banks have reduced interest rates so that they can spur demand for goods and services. So it's had a huge impact all over. In addition to that, just trying to narrow down to which sectors are affected and which ones are not. We've seen a huge impact on in particular, the airline and the travel and tourism sector. Huge impact. Arrivals have reduced by 50–60%. We've seen a huge impact on the automotive sector. They say that in China alone, car sales have come down by 86%. That's how big it has been. Manufacturing businesses, especially those that are manufacturing for non-essential goods who were asked to lock down, are reeling as we speak. On the other spectrum, on the other extreme, we've seen businesses that have benefited from this. For example, the health sector will benefit. We've seen also other sectors like the ICT sector, like ourselves, are going to benefit because people are working from home and they are needing more connectivity and more devices in their home in order to keep going. So there's a whole spectrum of, in terms of the impact on different sectors that we've seen. In a nutshell, it is with us. It's going to affect all businesses to varying extents, and let's brace up for it.
Thank you for that backdrop. I can take this opportunity to just welcome Sharon Bwanya onto the panel. Fabian, can you just give us a view from a Zimbabwean perspective, particularly? Godfrey has just set out to talk about the global situation, and of course, we are part of the global village, but there are very specific dynamics that affect us as Zimbabweans. Where has this COVID-19 caught us at this particular point in time? Fabian, sorry, your mic is on mute. If you could just unmute for us.
I'm muted, yeah. That's fine.
Thank
Sorry
you so
about
much.
that, yeah. Yeah, what I see from a Zimbabwean perspective, Zimbabwe is a small economy. So the impact is going to be very significant because government is not able to bail out business. Neither is government going to be able to bail out people who are unemployed as a result of the lockdown or the effects of the COVID-19. So sustainability of businesses in Zimbabwe is a big issue, I think, going forward. Going concern, I think a lot of companies are going to fail to continue in business because demand will be lower, because production will be lower. I see a lot of loss of value, for businesses in Zimbabwe. This loss of value could be as a result of, assets being written down, maybe because they are no longer working, and there is not much use for it. I also think that there is a major disruption, around businesses, even after this whole issue is over. I don't think it will be business as usual, even in Zimbabwe, moving more, online and being able to do business more online. I think we should export rates by people who are borrowed because there is no income. I think Mr. Joa did talk about the unemployment rate. In other parts of the world, in developed economies, governments are able to pay people who are not going to work some form of wage, maybe 30%, 20%, or 80% in other instances. Zimbabwe is not going to be able to do that. So you can imagine the impact on the workers. It's already beginning to happen. I know in my business, we're already beginning to have discussions about and what are we going to do about salaries? Because if we are not producing, we're not going to be able to pay salaries. So that's my my view of what this means for Zimbabwe. It's also good to note, I'm sure panelists would know that our health system is very fragile. It's not very good at the moment. So our ability to cope, if we have got a major infection in the country, our ability to cope is not going to be there. So we pray that we will not have a pervasive attack of this virus in Zimbabwe, because our health system is not going to cope. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Fabian, for setting that view. Let me just answer a couple of questions that I'm seeing on the webinar. For those of you who've joined us, welcome. We're here in a first conversation around thriving and surviving the COVID-19 crisis. We have our three panelists, Godfrey Joa, Fabian Gwatidzo, and Sharon Bwanya, who will be helping us to navigate this situation. As a panelist or as an attendee, if you're attending via Zoom, you will currently not be able to speak, and your video won't be enabled, and that is quite normal. When we come to the Q&A session, I will enable people to ask questions via audio as well as through the Q&A button that you will find on your Zoom application. So throughout the discussion, if you want to ask any question, please go ahead and either put your hand up, and I will choose a few people to ask or answer or comment. And you can also do that via the chat. I will be watching the chat for questions that come through. At this point in time, we're just giving the panelists an opportunity to just air their views about where we find ourselves. We've just had Godfrey Joa just explaining the global setting within which we find ourselves, and then Fabian Gwatidzo talking about particularly the Zimbabwean context that we find ourselves in, the specific challenges we're facing. Now, Sharon, I just want to come over to you as someone who works in the investment sector, in the financial sector. Tell us a little bit about, because obviously everybody's concern at the end of the day is bread and butter issues. What are you seeing as you look at the market and as you look at business in this current market, given the two global and local challenges that we face?
Right. Apologies for joining a little later than I should have. So this pandemic is essentially an issue of lives and livelihoods. It's impacting people in terms of their health and possibly life and death issue, and also livelihoods. So I will take a bit of a departing view from what it is that it is not pretty. There's a lot of doom and gloom, but from an investment perspective, also a lot of excitement, because there are a lot of opportunities. One of my colleagues said, never waste a good crisis, because when times are like this, there will be three groups of companies: the ones that are facing an existential crisis, and we're seeing that with maybe tourism and travel industry. Then you will have the ones that are thriving, present company included, those in the telecoms sector, and those that can sort of float by in limbo and ride the storm and come out on the other end, either with having missed a lot of opportunities or having just come out as unscathed as possible. These are like professional services that are continuing to be able to work from home. And then there's the investor with a long-term view, who is looking at opportunities to either pick up assets at a song or redefining investment landscape, starting to think about what the world will look like post the pandemic. So it's a very busy time for us and a very exciting time for us, because one man's meat, another man's treasure, said to say, but it is what it is.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a fantastic departure point. And I will kick off the question and answer session by just picking up on your three groups of companies that you've mentioned there. There's those who are facing an existential crisis in terms of life and death issues. Is the company going to pull through? Is it going to survive, particularly in certain sectors, as Joa put them out earlier on? Certain sectors are going to be the biggest losers, and certain sectors the biggest winners. Then there's those who can pick up incredible opportunities. Then there's those who can float along. And that is a departure point, because I'd like to believe that a lot of our attendees fall into one of these three categories. Perhaps can the panel, maybe I'll point this one to Mr. Gwatidzo, those that are facing an existential crisis, given your business in audit and in financial service, those that are facing an existential crisis, what would be the 2 or 3 key things that you would be saying to them right now that they need to actually look at in order to weather the storm, because it's not pretty?
Thank you, Dumi. think most companies are going to face an existential crisis, which I call the going concern crisis or sustainability. I do agree with Sharon. There are a few and very few that will thrive in the current environment. But here is what I think companies should be looking at doing. I think the first step needs to be to right size or to downsize. You've got to look at your fixed costs because the fixed costs are not going to go away. They are there. And they have got to be paid, and salaries is one big one, and rentals and whatever fixed cost that you have got. I think businesses need to look at that, and then they've got to right size. They've got to cut down. That's number one. Number two, I think those businesses need to engage their employees to be able to come up with agreements on how to move forward, with employees. This is a difficult one because, most of our employees to mouth. And so if they don't get a salary at the end of the month, the impact is significant. And yet that is the reality. And so businesses need to be talking already, with employees to look at, what does this mean and how do we manage costs? Because if you are not going to, to produce revenue, then you're not going to have the money to be able to pay. Downsize or right size, engage employees, and then thirdly is to be able to look at, the possibility of working, online. The possibility of taking your services, whatever you do, online, so that you are able to serve your clients, you are able to earn some revenue. There is a lot of disruption that's happening already. The Internet of Things needs to come into play here. So I think businesses have got to, start using, to going online to be able to manage this. We're trying that ourselves in my business. I mean, everyone works from home. Everyone has been empowered to have access, but still there are challenges because some of our clients are not geared for working online. But that's where I think we've got. So I'll say those three things: take your business online and make sure that you can supply your services online. Engage your employees, with a view to downsize and cut on your fixed costs.
Fantastic points. Thank you so much.
Just to comment on that. I agree with Fabian on that. I think that it's important to downsize or right size for the environment. I also think that you need to look at the whole matter of clients or customers and how you interface with them in this environment. You need to keep your customers. You need to keep them informed. You need to look at ways of continuing to serve them in this environment. A typical manufacturing business, for example, needs to be able to say, how do we get our product to our customers? Yeah. We were using supermarkets and people can't go there. Should we use delivery services? Should we look at other ways? If you look at what's happened internationally, one of the biggest gainers in this environment is Amazon, because they run a delivery service for different kinds of things. And they are having it good in that way. So it's customers, it's employees, it's your business partners. You're going to have to reschedule the payment of your creditors and tell them to hold back a bit because your cash flows are not right. You're going to have to speak to your bankers and tell them to hold back a bit because your cash flows are not right. These are all negotiations that businesses will need to enter into in order to survive and perhaps a little later look to thrive.
Fantastic. Sharon, would you want to add anything onto that fantastic list? I think we've been given right size or downsize, engage the employees, look at the possibilities of working offline and online, engage clients and customers, and engage business partners, extended business partners. Is there anything you'd want to add to that plethora of things that businesses should put in their toolkit right now, particularly from an investor's point of view?
I would say this crisis presents an opportunity for businesses to recalibrate. One of the things, particularly the class of businesses that can float through this, should in my view be doing, is to refine their technical capacity. This is the time to be doing trainings. This is the time to be fixing all those admin issues, policies, and revisiting that dusty strategy document and that risk register and updating it and re-strategizing for what the marketplace is going to look like. So I think, if anything, for those that can manage to float along, this is time to capacitate, re-strategize, and make sure that when things return to a new normal, you hit the ground running, because your competitors are certainly not sleeping. They are positioning themselves to take up the new spaces that are going to come up, to dump old ways that will no longer be compatible. So it's really a time for planning.
Fantastic. You've mentioned two words that lead us into the next section. While we are in this little pause, attendees rather, I invite you at this point in time to start putting in some questions so that we can engage together. The questions can be sent through the Q&A, or alternatively, you can raise your hand and we will identify you for a question. If you do ask a question, may I ask you to keep it brief and to the point, so that we have a lot of time for everybody to ask questions. I see I've got a hand up here. Emmanuel Mutete, I think you'd like to ask a question. I'm going to enable your mic to talk now, and then we'll come back to the panelists to specifically speak about the new normal and risk. But let's hear from the attendees. Emmanuel? Okay, Emmanuel, you might want to unmute your mic. We'll come back to you. While you're doing that, I will throw a question at Godfrey. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are the specific risks that businesses in this current situation are facing, and what are the key mitigating, or maybe at the moment we're no longer mitigating, we're now reacting to the risks that are on the ground. Maybe chat to us about that.
Yeah, there are different kinds of risks that come into play in this environment. Ultimately, one may look at what's happened to your market in terms of demand, in terms of pricing. What are you going to do? Can you push product? People have very little money in their pockets. How do you continue to have revenues? So you might have to mitigate that by looking at some of your pricing strategies, some ways of continuing to get product to your customers. I think that a lot of business, we've seen it already, a lot of businesses have had to postpone price increases that were in the pipeline, just to make sure that they don't outprice themselves out of the market. So that's one risk that businesses are going to have to address. I spoke already about the credit risk, the failure to be able to repay. You need to be able to speak to your bankers and reschedule your loans, get a repayment holiday or moratorium on those loans. There are other risks. There are issues around the way you deliver your goods and services. You'd have to look at those processes. Right now, you can't move, you can't travel because you are under lockdown. You'd have to look at how else you can continue to do business given this environment. And this may well be a new normal, as you say, where we are going to have to rejig our processes, our ways of delivering goods and services. So just those are the two risks that come to mind at the moment. There are a lot of other risks that we are going to have to look to mitigate.
Okay, fantastic. I've got a question here from the floor, and I think it speaks to the issue of both the risks and the opportunities that have been mentioned before. And Joanna Rayeni says, these are good points, but how do they suit the informal sector, the vendors, the small to medium enterprises? How do we deal with that? Can I position this for Fabian, maybe initially, and then maybe any of the two panelists, specifically the informal sector, because as we know, 90 to 95% of this country is informally employed. So how does these particular things we've talked about, how do they affect the informal sector?
Thanks, Jimmy. I do think that they are affected just as much as big companies are affected. Informal sector is a business. Sometimes it's just the scale, that is different. So the issue is that yes, they are going to be affected by the problem of liquidity and the working capital challenges. It doesn't matter if I think some of the big companies could be able to weather the working capital and liquidity challenges, that could arise. But for informal sector, the hardworking mother who is selling tomatoes by the side of the road, needs to sell every day to be able to, keep going. And that's not going to be possible because of the lockdown and people being asked to not be in the streets. So significant risk there. The money that we use for business, which we call working capital, is not going to be there. So that's risk number one. And let me not talk about mitigation. And then for me, the biggest risk that is there, for businesses, and more significant for informal sector, is there's going to be loss of experienced, skilled staff here. And that loss is going to happen in two ways. Number one, there's a possibility that someone will die. Okay, there are so many people who are dying, experienced doctors and everywhere. So death, when it happens, it's gonna have significant impact on your business. If the breadwinner is affected there. And yeah, so that is a big, I think, a big problem, and that also affects the informal sector. And I said working capital does affect the informal sector. For the formal sector, the other risk that I see is just the loss of confidentiality in terms of when you are transmitting information now that people are working offline, that information needs to move from point A to point B. Sometimes you're able to move it, online. Sometimes you have got to move it offline. And there is a risk of loss of information, but also loss of confidentiality. And because we're talking about the new normal, we, for a lot of formal businesses where you are now working online, just the inability to be able to monitor what people are doing. I think we can get people working, online, and they are not in the office, but I don't think we've got the tools to be able to monitor, what people are actually doing, and apart from the output that they are going to generate. Yeah, so that's my, I don't know if I answered your question based on that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kwatiso. Maybe I can bounce it to Sharon. The issue of being able to, because we're all talking about this new normal, where we must be able to operate virtually, I guess, where we're not congregating in one workplace any longer. how do we manage that going forward? Are we geared for that? Is our mindset as Zimbabweans geared for that? And if not, or if so, how?
So, two things. First, I wanted to hop on to the previous question about how does this apply to the informal sector, particularly vendors. I think it was. On that, what I wanted to say was that informal sector does not mean disorganized sector. I think vendors have the aptitude and the capability to be organized, and with proper organization, I actually think there is no reason why a structure could not have been put in place for a market store. Say in Highfields, Machipisa, there's an actual built structure for a marketplace for fruits and vegetables, which fall under essential services. One does not see any legal reason why those would still not be able to operate. Because what is the difference between a fruit and veg section in Pick and Pay and a well-organized market in Highfields, where sanitizing of hands and social distancing is being enforced? So I think everybody has to be flexible and to be organized, because formal businesses have had to reorganize to respond to the current challenges. And I think informal sector, instead of throwing hands up and saying, nobody thinks about us, nobody wants to make a plan for us, could make a plan for itself and say, hold up, we are essential services. What are the guidelines? We are meeting the guidelines. And this is not unprecedented. In India, you have municipal police right there at the market stalls monitoring the social distancing. People should still be able to buy fruit and vegetables in Highfields and in Bari and still be safe while doing it. So that's what I wanted to add there. And for some of the fortunate SMEs, I'll give an example of those in the fitness industry. They've really responded well, where people are still paying their subscriptions for gym and getting online classes. So everybody is having to adapt and think outside the box and redefine. So I'm going to ask you to repeat your second question to me again.
No, that's fine. Actually, I just wanted to springboard because I think we're on a view that there's a lot of questions coming in about informal sector issues, and people asking, should government what is government's role in actually enabling in this existential crisis that businesses are facing, both formal and informal? Maybe Godfrey, I can point that one to you, and then we can come back to Mr. Gwatidzo and Sharon.
Typically, where governments have adequate resources, they've come in by way of subsidizing salaries and subsidizing earnings for the informal sector and small businesses. They've come in by way of reduction in taxes. They've come in different ways to try and mitigate the impact. For our government, my view would be they should look to mobilize resources internationally. We know that there are institutions, partners out there that are able to help out if you've got a clear plan on how you want to do it and how you want to sustain livelihoods in the households out there. So that's my view. They should look to do that. They should also look to see how your informal traders can amalgamate their produce, such as has been suggested by Sharon, where perhaps you've got a safe environment for people doing different things, and government can facilitate that and make sure that the rate of infection or possibility of infection is reduced. So I think that government has a role to play. One of the things that we're going to have to monitor is what happens in 21 days. We've done 7 of them. What happens after 21 days? Do we lessen the lockdown? Because for us, it becomes an issue of comparing being able to put food on the table. You either die from hunger or from the coronavirus. It's literally that option. So there would have to be some give and take that allows people to maintain their livelihoods. So that's what I think the government can do.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just watching the Q&A and the feedback that's coming on the Q&A. And I'm seeing two types of responses to what we've been saying so far. There is, on the one hand, there are people that are asking in relation to what has been said, how businesses can actually manage their fixed costs and all the things that you've talked about so far. But then there's also the feeling on the other hand that we're not being realistic about the fact that SMEs, both formal and informal, as well as those that are informalized, are not necessarily, like Sharon said, disorganized, but they are still strongly impacted, and our government is unlikely to be able to caucus enough resources to sustain the ecosystems that are being talked about. So I'm just giving the panelists some feedback to let you know what are some of the conversations that are happening on the side, just in case you're not able to read through them as you talk. But I think Sandy Ncube, I'm going to allow her a moment to, oh, okay, sorry, I can see Helen Zulukawadza. Let me allow you to talk, because I think you made a comment about the realisticness of some of this. Maybe let me allow you to elaborate on that. I'm going to allow you to talk, Helen. Please unmute your mic and go ahead and make your comment or your question.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dumi, for that. I think that there's a real need for us to be a bit realistic, because when we talk of informal sector, I think we tend to gravitate towards vendors. We don't necessarily go and gravitate towards an informal sector, which is very structured, has a lot of people they do employ, and having to look at ways of how do we move forward. So, I mean, I take the example given that, yes, there's definitely a need to downsize. I mean, we're thinking about it as we look at our organization to say, what is our way forward? But downsizing also has a cost element to it, which is something that's going to have to come in and into play, because if we're going to retrain somebody, there are legalities towards that. And I guess what I'm not getting here is what help, or not necessarily that we're asking for help, but as consultants, what would you give to an informal person who's not a vendor? So I'd have nothing to vend to anybody. It's more consultancy, or maybe smaller businesses which are very formally structured. What is the way forward? And I'm not really getting that. And I think every time we talk of informal people, we gravitate towards vendors. When we talk about people getting some form of subsidies from the government, these are people who are registered with the small and indigenous players. And you know, a lot of that is politically motivated, and a lot of us are not involved or engaged in that area, because I don't want to go and sit in an office with some political person to just get, so I'm not going to benefit from that.
So your key question, Helen, is if these three panelists were your consultants, what's the key delivery, given that we don't have any structures that are going to deliver money to the door? So what is the key help that they could help you to think through as a small business? Fantastic question. I'm going to take that question. Panelists, please keep it in mind. Let me take a second question before you get a chance to answer that one. I'm going to take a question from the chat group, where Sandisiwe Ncube says, you speak about fixed and variable costs. How do businesses manage this, especially if certain costs like telecoms related costs will become more significant with the need to be online? So I think one of the recommendations was that look at costs and cost cutting, particularly the fixed costs. But how do you manage that? You still need some of those fixed costs in order to function. How can that be managed? So those are two questions. Let me start with Joa. You can pick any of those two to answer. Oh,
just remind me the first one again.
You can start with Helen's one.
All right. I think Helen's one depends on what type of informal business you are. Okay. If you are providing a professional consulting type business, you can do that from home. You can engage with your customers from home. You can work remotely and online and still do the same kind of things. If you are providing goods perhaps what you'd need to do is network with your clients on platforms and arrange ways in which you can deliver things from them in a structured way. So I think that there are discrete ways in which you can still be able to do business and keep going even in this environment. If you've got workers, I accept that if you are in a factory setup, it's not going to be possible for your workers to travel to the workplace and produce whatever gadgets you produce. But if there are ways in which they can work from home, for example, as Telco, what we've done is we've got people working from home or from remote sites that we've set up, and we've got a system that monitors productivity throughout the entire ecosystem we've established. And we can monitor that, and we are able to serve our clients and service our clients and be with them. So in the same way, I think there are ways in which, for example, I'm on platforms for small businesses and informal traders, and they're still talking about buying a laptop, buying this or that or the other, and there are ways in which they're able to centrally exchange those at some point without infringing the regulations.
Thank you so much for that. Does this not actually speak directly into Sharon's point around the new normal? We are not going to be able to continue to do business as we have done it before. And the enablement to do that is probably going to be very difficult. Sharon, you wanted to make a comment there.
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the things that SMEs could be doing right now is going into their files and pulling out their contracts that they have, where they have obligations, whether to suppliers or to other stakeholders, and assessing whether they cannot call up the force majeure clause to give themselves breathing space and to just be proactive and say, this is what's happening, this is how it impacts our ability to perform, and we're now calling upon the safe haven to suspend our obligations during this time. So that could be one thing that maybe Helen and other SMEs could resort to for temporary relief during this period where hands are tied, depending on what line of business you are in. Perhaps there's very little you can do except to get this legal sort of relief and suspension of obligation. But also just to add that this is one of those things that is a make or break for certain businesses and certain business models. That's just the reality, that some of them cannot be salvaged, will not be salvaged, and it's time to move on to other things where that is the stark reality.
Fabian, do you want to add to that?
Yes, Helen, to run a business, you on a sustainable basis, you still need to be able to have working capital. I'm not sure what it is that you do, but so you need, every business needs working capital. Unless where you are a consultant and you need very little of it, but you still need to be able to move around, you need to be able to support your working capital. That's why I was talking about right sizing. It's key to be able to make sure that you have got sufficient cash to be able to meet your obligations, and you right size those obligations. And we need to look at the impact, also be able to just assess the impact of this COVID-19 on your specific business. Is your business going to be able to continue? What
Sorry, Mr. Kwatito, we seem to be losing a little
on
bit
your
there.
business, assess the impact on your business and be able to see how best you react. Okay, yeah, maybe it's probably it's network challenges. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So So I was saying, and then the final thing I wanted to say to Helen is that if your business is a business that's informal but properly registered, you are paying checks and so on, you then need to make sure that your record keeping in terms of accounting and so on is correct and is taught, so that you don't have problems with regulators as well and the authorities like Zimbabwe and so on.
Maybe we can give Helen some specifics. Let's try and give Helen some specifics. You can go to a landlord and negotiate a rent reduction or a rent freeze for a season as you have no revenues, and ask them to stop collecting the rent for a month or two. You can lay off non-essential staff and put them on unpaid leave. You can reduce your bandwidth for internet. There are things along most major variable cost lines that you can do to mitigate your cost and downsize to the right level in these times. Certain costs are fixed and won't be able to be adjustable in the short term. That point is accepted.
Thank you for that. I'm just watching the time, and we have literally 4 minutes left in our webinar. And I just want to I know a lot of questions haven't been answered, and what I want to assure people is that this is a series. We started off the conversation, and we will continue the conversation on a week-by-week basis. However, we are out of time for today. What I would like the panelists to do is to finish off by giving us their key takeaway points from this particular session, which was specifically to do with business continuity during this period. And we will then pick up the conversation next week with very specific things that attendees are asking in this regard. So I will start with Sharon. What are your closing thoughts and closing remarks in regard to how do we weather this storm?
I think I'll just end off on a bit of a sentimental note that yes, business is about the money, but fundamentally it is about the people being your staff members and your customers or clients. So I think this period of uncertainty is certainly the period to stay in touch with the staff members to reassure them and with the clients. There are these companies that right now are making donations towards fighting the pandemic. That's a lot of goodwill they are buying into, because we are seeing this and we are committing to ourselves that these are the companies that care and these are the companies that we will support post the pandemic. So I think it is an important time while trying to survive. Setting yourself up for thriving is to hang on to the critical human resource by reassuring the staff and making mutually acceptable arrangements to weather the storm, and staying in touch with the customers and sending simple messages of being a good corporate citizen who cares fundamentally about lives.
Thank you so much. It's a strong ending. Mr. Gwatidzo, what would be your takeaway points from the session?
I think every business needs to make sure that they weather the storm and that they are going to continue in business, which in accounting we call the going concern. That should be the most engaging question for every business person. Is my business going to continue tomorrow after this COVID? What is the impact? So I think every business needs to assess the impact of COVID-19 on their business, and that assessment will lead into the responses that a business needs to make. Because here we can generalize, but once a business assesses, they are then able to respond appropriately to the risks that they are seeing. Some of those risks, Sharon did mention, businesses are not going to be able to carry on. They will fall down. But every business needs to assess. Do an assessment of the respond appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. So assess your risks and respond appropriately. Thank you. Mr. Joa, what are your takeaways?
For me, I'd like to encourage businesses out there to be forward-looking. The coronavirus is going to end. So my emphasis would be on reinventing themselves, on reimagining their business methods, their business strategies, and reinventing themselves in terms of how they deliver their goods and services. I think there are concepts like working from home, working remotely, that are going to be central to how businesses can thrive when similar pandemics or similar disruptions happen in the future. So look to reinvent yourselves, look to do things differently in the future.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A. We will continue to engage with those questions as even though we're ending the webcast. And the parting shots are right size, engage your people, engage your clients, look at ways of working online, engage your business partners like your banking partners in your supply chain, and redefine who you are during this period. Thank you so much for joining us. We will have a second follow-on of this webcast next week, Monday at the same time. And we are very keen to hear your questions in the meanwhile so that we can put together a panel that can speak to the very specifics of different kinds of businesses. Thank you, Mr. Gwatidzo. Thank you, Sharon Dwanya. Thank you, Godfrey Joa, for joining us this afternoon. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay, cheers now.